The night Christopher collapsed, Abigail was the first person Ferdinand called. Not Walter, his underboss, not Donald, his most powerful ally. Abigail. Because everyone in that syndicate knew, even if they never said it out loud, that she was the one Christopher actually needed. Acute liver failure. Rare toxin. Someone had been poisoning him for weeks. The black market transplant waitlist was months long, and Christopher had weeks. Ferdinand told Abigail directly, without a new liver, Christopher would die. Abigail told Ferdinand to test her blood that same night. She didn't tell Christopher. She knew what he would say. He would rage, forbid it, throw her out before she finished the sentence. So she signed the consent forms before Ferdinand finished reading them back to her. Private clinic, off-the-book surgical team. She laid herself on that table and gave up part of her own liver to keep the man she loved alive. 6 hours of surgery. She woke up alone, in serious pain, to Ferdinand telling her the transplant had taken. Christopher was going to live. Abigail lay in that recovery room and told herself it was worth it. She told herself that when he found out, everything would change. She was wrong about every part of that. 3 weeks later, Abigail was still moving carefully, still waking in the night from pain that hadn't settled. Christopher was already back at full strength, running meetings, filling rooms, acting like the illness had been nothing. Invitations went out for a major gathering. Abigail assumed it was a celebration of his recovery. She walked in, still pressing a hand against her healing wound. Christopher took the microphone in front of hundreds of syndicate members and announced he was getting engaged. The woman he named was Christabel, daughter of Donald, a billionaire connected to every major criminal network in the region. The alliance would triple his territory. He explained it without emotion, like a business announcement. He never looked at Abigail once. She pushed through the crowd and reached him before Walter could stop her. "How?" she said. Just that word. Christopher looked at her the way you look at someone you've already forgotten. He told her she had no bloodline, no leverage, no strategic value. When her voice broke and she reminded him of the surgery, the 6 hours, the scar she would carry for the rest of her life, his expression didn't move. He told her he had known about the transplant the entire time. He had identified her as a donor match weeks before his collapse. He had manipulated Ferdinand into steering her toward the idea without her realizing it. He needed a liver without owing a rival syndicate a favor. Abigail had been the cleanest solution. She had served her purpose. He was done with her. Walter removed her from the building. She ended up outside the gate with her stitches pulling and blood seeping through her clothes. Standing alone in the dark, running back through every moment of the past year, understanding now what all of it had actually been. He hadn't loved her and lost his way. He had targeted her from the start. Every quiet moment, every private confession, every time he told her she kept him human, all of it had been management. She had been a resource with an expiration date, and the date had come. The grief hit like a wave, but underneath it, something harder was forming, something that didn't feel like sadness at all. Abigail made one move. She went to Annabelle. Annabelle was Christopher's estranged older sister, cut out of the family years earlier for refusing to be part of the operation. Christopher had written her off without a second thought. It was one of his cleaner mistakes, because Annabelle had been quietly collecting everything Christopher had never bothered to hide from her, and when Abigail arrived at her door, barely standing, Annabelle pulled her inside without a word. 2 weeks of proper recovery. Then Annabelle sat across from her and explained what she had access to. The Ghost Ledger, a fully encrypted archive containing blackmail material, financial leverage, and direct access codes to the shipping ports powering Christopher's entire operation, the real engine behind his empire, protected by a biometric lock requiring Christopher's blood to open. Annabelle pressed her thumb to the scanner without being asked twice. Abigail went through everything: financial records, private communications, chemical purchase orders, files Ferdinand had quietly backed up over the years, and buried inside all of it was something that stopped her cold. The toxin that had destroyed Christopher's liver had not come from a rival syndicate. The chemical signature traced directly to a pharmaceutical company controlled by Donald, Christopher's new father-in-law, the man behind the alliance he had traded Abigail for. Donald and Christabel had been poisoning Christopher for months, targeting his liver deliberately, engineering his desperation so he would have no choice but to accept the alliance they were offering. They had manufactured his near death and then arrived as his salvation, with their hands still around his throat. Abigail sat with that for a long time. She could warn Christopher, hand him the proof, watch him realize that the woman he had just married was one of the people who had tried to kill him. He would be desperate, he would owe her, he would probably beg. Part of her wanted that badly enough to be honest about it. But warning him meant saving him again, stepping between him and the disaster he had walked into through his own greed, being useful to him one more time. She was finished being useful to Christopher. She called Tracy instead, a rival boss who had spent years looking for a way into Christopher's network and never found the opening. Abigail gave her the opening, the exact shipping coordinates for Christopher's largest venture, a massive cargo run he had funded by pledging nearly every liquid asset he owned as collateral. Christopher had bet everything on this single shipment because he believed the Donald alliance made him untouchable. He had stopped being careful because he thought he had already won. Christopher was at a private anniversary dinner with Christabel and Donald, toasting the arrival of his cargo when Walter called. Walter never panicked. This time, his voice was unrecognizable. Tracy's crew had hit every vessel simultaneously. They hadn't stolen the cargo, they had destroyed it. Every ship, every container, every piece of collateral Christopher had pledged, gone. In a single night, he had lost everything he had staked his future on. He turned to Donald immediately, the alliance, the billions, the safety net he had paid for with Abigail's humiliation. Donald set his glass down and explained calmly that the marriage had always been a transaction. Christopher was now a liability. The transaction was over. Then Christabel told him about the poison. She laid it out without drama. The months of slow contamination, the deliberate liver failure, the engineered desperation designed to force him into the alliance on their terms. Once the marriage gave them full access, everything he had built was going to be absorbed. She explained it the way someone explains a plan that mostly worked, looking at him like he was already past tense. Christopher's hand went to his side, to the transplant, to the piece of Abigail living inside him, keeping him alive while he processed that he had publicly destroyed her to marry the woman who had tried to kill him. His investors were already being contacted. His enforcers were doing the arithmetic. By morning, the syndicate he had spent years building was dissolving. He fell to his knees in that room, the most feared man in the city, finished, surrounded by people who had never once been on his side. The estate went first, then the network, then the money, then the men. Christopher moved under a false name and took work at a shipyard doing manual labor, and his body, under the weight of everything collapsing around it, began rejecting the transplant. He needed specific medication only Ferdinand could manage. Ferdinand had vanished completely. The rejection pain settled in his side and didn't leave. He spent nights lying in a borrowed room, running through every decision that had led him there, understanding with complete clarity that every consequence was a straight line back to his own choices. Knowing that helped nothing. His phone rang with an unknown number. He answered. It was Abigail. "I know about the rejection," she said. "I gave Tracy the coordinates, and I knew about Donald's poison months before the anniversary dinner." She paused. "I watched you walk into that marriage, and I didn't say a word." "You could have warned me," Christopher said. His voice cracked on the last word.
You could have not thrown me out with my stitches bleeding."
He told her he was sorry. He said it multiple times, the way a man says something when it's the only word he has left. He begged her for the medication. He told her she was the only person who had ever actually loved him. He promised her whatever remained of his life. Abigail let him finish. Then she told him she had already done the one thing she was willing to do for him. That was on the operating table. It was real, and he had taken it and thrown it away. She told him she hoped he survived because she wanted him to spend every remaining day understanding the full weight of what he had chosen. Then she ended the call. Christopher sat in the silence with nothing left, no leverage, no argument, no one left to reach. 6 months later, Christopher was still at the shipyard, still alive. His body had stabilized on its own, which felt less like a mercy and more like an obligation to keep living with what he'd done. He worked with his hands, stayed invisible, and had stopped expecting anything to change. Then a car pulled in, and a woman named Camellia stepped out. She represented the foreign syndicate that had absorbed Christopher's former territory during his collapse. He stood and waited. He didn't run. There was nothing left to protect. Camellia handed him a sealed envelope. She told her Abigail had died 4 days earlier from surgical complications she had known about for months and kept entirely private. Camellia said nothing else. She left. Christopher opened the envelope. A letter in Abigail's handwriting, documents underneath it. He read the letter first. She wrote that she wanted him to know the truth about who she actually was, that she had never told him because she had wanted to be loved for herself, not for her name. She wrote that she hoped it helped him understand. She wrote that she doubted it would. He turned to the documents. Ownership records, trust filings, a private holding structure he had never heard of. He read through everything once, then went back to the beginning because the first reading didn't make sense. The port access codes forming the backbone of his entire operation had never belonged to Christopher outright. They had been licensed through a private trust, invisibly, for years. That trust was the real reason his supply routes had never been successfully cut, the real reason rivals couldn't dislodge him, the reason his operation had always run with a stability he had attributed entirely to himself. The trust belonged to Abigail's family. Her father, a man Christopher had never met, whose existence Abigail had never mentioned, had been one of the most quietly powerful criminal operators in the region for 30 years. Not loud, not famous, the kind of man whose infrastructure everyone used without knowing it. Abigail was his only heir. She had been managing the trust in silence for years before she ever met Christopher. She had never told him because she had wanted one real relationship in her life that wasn't built on what she controlled.
Christopher had built his empire on her foundation. Every port he accessed, every supply route that held, every reason his operation had the reach that made him untouchable, it had all run through her. He hadn't succeeded in spite of her. He had succeeded because of her. And he had never known. The letter said one final thing. When Walter put her outside his gate with her stitches bleeding, Abigail had made a decision she never reversed. She had not withdrawn the trust access. She had not pulled a single lever against him. She had let his empire stand, because even then, even after everything, she couldn't bring herself to be the one who tore it down. She had decided instead to let his own choices do that work. And they had. Every consequence Christopher lived through had not required her to do anything except step aside and let him be exactly who he was. Christopher set the documents down in the dirt. He had taken her liver. He had taken her love. He had taken years of invisible protection she had never once asked him to acknowledge.
He had thrown her away to build a future with people who were trying to kill him, and he had lost everything exactly the way she knew he would. The empire he had been most proud of had been standing on her name the entire time. He had just never known whose ground he was standing on. Abigail's last move had not been revenge. It had been the truth, delivered at the exact moment it could change nothing. Christopher had always believed he was the most dangerous person in any room he entered. He had spent years sharing a life with the woman who was actually holding the room together, and he had thrown her away.